Young millionaire marries a poor woman as a business deal. He never expected to fall in love with her. The last place Natalie Harper ever expected to be was in a penthouse office, staring down a man who looked like he belonged on magazine covers, offering her a marriage contract like it was just another item on his to-do list. "Let me get this straight," she said, gripping the edge of the chair to keep herself steady. "You want me to marry you for business reasons?" "Precisely," Christopher Grayson said, his voice smooth and measured, like he was discussing stock options instead of matrimony. He leaned back in his chair, the city skyline sprawling behind him as if it were his personal backdrop. 6 months, no more, no less. You fulfill your role as my wife, and I'll make sure your family's debts are erased. Completely. Natalie blinked, her head spinning. She had come here for a job interview, desperate to land anything that could help her mother, who was drowning in medical bills. She hadn't expected the young, self-made millionaire to walk into the room, look at her with those calculating blue eyes, and make a proposition that sounded straight out of a soap opera. "This has to be a joke," she said, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound composed. Christopher didn't flinch. He was unnervingly calm, his tailored suit flawless, his expression unreadable. "It's not a joke. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. I need a wife to finalize a merger with a traditional family-run company. They value stability and appearances. You need money. It's simple." Simple? Natalie almost laughed. Nothing about this was simple. She opened her mouth to argue, but the thought of her mother's tear-streaked face as she tried to hide another overdue hospital bill silenced her. "Why me?" she asked finally, narrowing her eyes. "You could hire a model or someone already rich. Why pick someone like me?" Christopher's gaze flickered just for a moment as if the question had caught him off guard. "Because you're believable," he said at last. "You're not polished or rehearsed. You're real." "That's exactly what I need. Real." Natalie wasn't sure if she should be flattered or insulted, but she couldn't deny the temptation in his offer. Her pride screamed at her to walk away, but the weight of her family's struggles kept her rooted to the spot. "And you're sure this is just business?" she pressed, her voice hardening. "No strings, no expectations." "Strictly business," Christopher confirmed, his tone clipped. "We'll have rules, boundaries. I won't interfere in your life and you won't interfere in mine. Once the 6 months are up, we part ways. Clean, simple, clean and simple." 2 things her life had never been. For a long moment, Natalie sat there, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. This wasn't a fairy tale, it wasn't love, it was a cold, calculated transaction. But it could save her family. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." Christopher stood, extending his hand like they'd just closed a business deal. "Welcome to the team, Mrs. Grayson." The word "Mrs." sent a shiver down her spine, but she shook his hand anyway, ignoring the strange jolt that ran through her at his touch. 2 weeks later, Natalie stood in front of a full-length mirror in a boutique bridal shop, wearing a wedding dress she hadn't picked out, for a wedding she never imagined having. "This one will do," Christopher said from behind her, his voice cool and distant. He didn't even look at her, his attention focused on his phone. Natalie bit back a retort. She wasn't here to impress him. This wasn't real. It was a transaction, nothing more. Still, as she turned back to the mirror, she caught her reflection and froze. The dress was exquisite, delicate lace, a sweetheart neckline, and a flowing train that made her look like someone she barely recognized. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like if this were real, if Christopher were looking at her with love instead of indifference, if this dress were for a man who truly adored her. "Is it acceptable?" Christopher asked, his tone impatient. She snapped out of her thoughts, her cheeks flushing. "It's fine." "Good," he said, already heading toward the door. "The wedding's in 3 days. Be ready." The ceremony was a blur. Natalie stood at the altar in a grand ballroom filled with strangers, her hand resting lightly in Christopher's. He looked impeccable, of course, his dark hair perfectly styled, his sharp jawline giving him an air of authority that made her feel small and out of place. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Christopher leaned in, his lips brushing her cheek in the barest imitation of a kiss. It was over in an instant, and she felt nothing. The reception was equally surreal. Natalie spent most of it smiling awkwardly at Christopher's business associates, who congratulated them like this was some great love story. Christopher, meanwhile, played the perfect husband, pulling out her chair, resting his hand lightly on her back and whispering just enough to sell the illusion. But it was all an act. Later that night, in the penthouse she now apparently shared with him, Natalie sat on the edge of the plush bed, staring at the city lights outside the window. "You'll have your own room," Christopher said from the doorway, his voice devoid of emotion. "You'll find everything you need there. If there's anything else, let me know." She turned to face him, her stomach twisting. "And how long do we keep this charade up?" 6 months, he said firmly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time all night. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker there, something almost human, but it was gone as quickly as it came. 6 months, she echoed, her voice hollow. As he walked away, leaving her alone in the cavernous room, Natalie wrapped her arms around herself and wondered how she'd survive pretending to be Mrs. Grayson. What she didn't realize was that pretending would soon become the least of her worries. Natalie's first morning as Mrs. Grayson began with the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and the sound of her name being spoken in a clipped, matter-of-fact tone. "Natalie," Christopher's voice called from the doorway of her new bedroom. She stirred, disoriented for a moment, the events of the last few days rushing back to her like a wave. She sat up, clutching the silk sheets, and found him standing there, perfectly dressed in a tailored gray suit, his tie a sharp contrast of navy blue. He looked like he'd already conquered half the world before she'd even opened her eyes. "We have a breakfast meeting." "Be downstairs in 30 minutes, he said, not waiting for her reply before turning on his heel and disappearing. "A breakfast meeting?" Natalie groaned, running a hand through her hair. She'd barely processed the fact that she was now legally someone's wife, and Christopher was already treating her like an employee. She stumbled out of bed, opened the closet, and froze. It was packed with designer dresses, shoes, and handbags she'd only ever seen in magazines. She hesitated, running her fingers over the delicate fabrics. It all felt so surreal, like she'd stepped into someone else's life. 30 minutes later, she stepped into the dining room wearing a simple but elegant cream-colored dress that hugged her just enough to feel appropriate. Christopher barely glanced up from his phone as she entered, but his sharp gaze flicked over her for a split second, and something unreadable crossed his face. "Good. You look the part," he said, standing and gesturing for her to follow. They rode together in his sleek black car, the silence between them palpable. Natalie stared out the window, the city blurring past as she tried to calm the nerves twisting in her stomach. She wasn't sure what she'd expected when she agreed to this arrangement, but it definitely wasn't being paraded into a high-end restaurant at 8 in the morning to meet with Christopher's business partners. The restaurant was breathtaking, all glass walls and polished marble, with waiters in crisp uniforms who greeted Christopher by name. They were led to a private table where 2 older men in expensive suits were already waiting. Christopher introduced her as his wife, his hand briefly resting on the small of her back. The gesture was so practiced, so calculated, that it felt almost mechanical. Natalie smiled politely, playing along as Christopher discussed mergers and investments she barely understood. She nodded when prompted, laughed softly when one of the men made a dry joke, and sipped her mimosa to keep her hands from trembling. Throughout it all, Christopher was the picture of confidence, charming, composed, and utterly in control. But as the meeting dragged on, Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every so often, she'd catch Christopher's gaze lingering on her, his blue eyes narrowing slightly as if he were trying to figure out a puzzle. She wondered what he saw. Did he regret choosing her for this absurd arrangement? Or worse, was he silently judging her every move? When the meeting finally ended, Christopher escorted her out with the same polite detachment he'd shown all morning. They didn't speak until they were back in the car, the hum of the engine filling the silence. "You did well," he said, his tone curt but not unkind. "They liked you." "Glad I could be of service," Natalie replied. Unable to keep the sarcasm from creeping into her voice, Christopher glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "Is this the part where you tell me how much you hate this arrangement?" She crossed her arms, meeting his gaze head-on. "I think the word hate would be an understatement." To her surprise, the corner of his mouth twitched, almost like he was fighting a smile. "You'll get used to it." "Doubtful," she shot back, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of amusement in his eyes. But just as quickly, his expression hardened and he turned his attention back to the road. The next few weeks passed in a blur of carefully orchestrated appearances. Christopher took her to charity galas, high-profile dinners, and exclusive events, where she was expected to smile, nod, and play the part of the devoted wife. Natalie quickly learned how to navigate the world of the wealthy, how to recognize subtle power plays, how to deflect intrusive questions, and how to keep her mask firmly in place. But it wasn't all glamorous. Behind closed doors, her life felt like a lonely, gilded cage. Christopher was distant, buried in work and barely speaking to her unless it was necessary. She spent most of her days wandering the penthouse, trying to ignore the ache of loneliness that settled in her chest. One evening, after yet another exhausting gala, Natalie kicked off her heels and collapsed onto the sofa in the living room. She was still wearing the emerald green gown Christopher had insisted she wear, its intricate beading catching the soft glow of the city lights outside. "You handled yourself well tonight," Christopher said, his voice startling her. She hadn't even noticed him come in. She looked up to find him standing by the window, his tie loosened and his hands in his pockets. He looked less like the polished businessman she was used to and more human, vulnerable, even. "Thanks," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "I think I deserve an Oscar for that performance." Christopher's lips curved into a faint smile. "It wasn't all an act." "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, sitting up. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. "You're better at this than I expected. You're convincing." Natalie frowned, unsure whether to take that as a compliment or an insult. "Maybe I'm just really good at pretending." His eyes met hers then, and for a moment the mask he always wore seemed to slip. "Maybe," he said quietly, before turning and walking away. It wasn't until a month into their arrangement that things began to change. It started small, Christopher asking her opinion on his business pitches, surprising her with a new set of paints when he overheard her mention she used to love painting. Then there were the moments when he seemed to let his guard down, like when they stayed up late one night talking about their childhoods, or when he'd laugh at one of her sarcastic remarks, the sound warm and genuine. But the moment she realized things were shifting came one rainy evening. They were returning from yet another event, the rain pounding against the car windows as they drove through the city. Natalie was staring out at the downpour when Christopher suddenly said, "Stop the car." The driver pulled over, and before she could ask what was happening, Christopher stepped out into the rain. He walked around to her side, opened her door, and extended his hand. "What are you doing?" she asked, staring at him like he'd lost his mind. He smirked, his hair already slick with rain. "Come on." Reluctantly, she took his hand, letting him pull her out into the storm. The rain was cold and relentless, soaking them both within seconds, but Christopher didn't seem to care. He led her to the middle of the sidewalk, twirling her once like they were dancing. "Are you always this insane?" she shouted over the rain, laughing despite herself. "Only when it comes to you," he said, his voice soft but clear. Her laughter faltered, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, she saw something in his gaze that wasn't calculated or guarded. It was raw, unspoken, and terrifyingly real. And in that moment, Natalie realized she wasn't pretending anymore. Natalie. Christopher's voice was low, hesitant, and startlingly close. She turned to find him standing at the edge of the living room, holding a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a bag from her favorite bakery in the other. It had been 3 days since the rainstorm, the moment that had shifted something between them, and while neither of them had spoken about it, the air between them felt undeniably different. "I thought you might like something warm to start your day," he said, his expression unreadable, though there was a softness in his voice that she couldn't ignore. She blinked, caught off guard. Christopher Grayson, the man who thrived on control and detachment, was standing in front of her with coffee and pastries, looking almost unsure of himself. "You got these for me?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. He shrugged, setting the bag and cup down on the glass coffee table. "You mentioned you liked their croissants. I thought it might save you the trouble of going out." Natalie sat down, cautiously reaching for the coffee. It was exactly how she liked it, 2 sugars, no cream. Her chest tightened at the small, thoughtful detail. "Thanks," she said quietly, unsure of what else to say. Christopher lingered for a moment, his hands in his pockets, before he finally spoke. "Are you free this evening?" She looked up, surprised. "I don't think I have a choice, do I?" His lips quirked into a small, almost smile. "No, you don't." "Be ready at 7. "Where are we going?" she asked. "You'll see," he replied cryptically before turning and walking out of the room. At exactly 7, Natalie descended the penthouse staircase in a midnight blue gown that clung to her figure in all the right ways. She had no idea where Christopher was taking her, but the dress he'd sent earlier in the day had been enough to clue her in that it was something formal. The fabric shimmered under the soft light, and the delicate diamond earrings he'd left with the dress completed the look. She felt like a stranger in her own skin, but for once, it wasn't a bad feeling. Christopher was waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs, his black tuxedo perfectly tailored, his hair swept back in that effortlessly polished way of his. When he looked up and saw her, something flickered across his face, something raw and unguarded that was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "You look." He paused, his voice unusually quiet. "Stunning." Heat rose to Natalie's cheeks, and she suddenly felt self-conscious under the weight of his gaze. "Thanks," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't look too bad yourself." For the first time, Christopher's smile reached his eyes, softening his sharp features. "Shall we?" he said, offering her his arm. The car ride was quiet but not uncomfortable. Christopher didn't offer any details about their destination, and Natalie decided not to press. When the car finally pulled to a stop, her breath caught. They were at the entrance of a luxury rooftop restaurant, its glowing lights casting a golden hue against the night sky. "I thought we could use a change of scenery," Christopher said as he helped her out of the car. The maitre d' greeted them by name and led them to a private table overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking, twinkling lights stretched as far as the eye could see, and the soft sound of a string quartet played in the background. A small candle flickered between them, casting a warm glow over the table. "This is beautiful," Natalie admitted as she sat down, her voice barely above a whisper. Christopher leaned back in his chair, watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I figured you deserved a night that wasn't about business." She tilted her head, studying him. "What's the catch?" No catch, he said, his lips curving into a small smile. Just dinner. The evening unfolded like something out of a dream. Course after course of each more decadent than the last. Christopher was surprisingly easy to talk to, and for the first time, their conversations felt natural, unforced. He asked about her childhood, her dreams, her favorite books, and each question felt genuine, like he truly wanted to know her. When the dessert arrived, a delicate chocolate soufflé, Christopher set his fork down and leaned forward. "I was wrong about you," he said suddenly. Natalie blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean? When we first made this arrangement, I thought you'd be a liability, someone I'd have to manage." His gaze softened, and for a moment she thought she saw a hint of regret. "But you're not. You're smart, capable, and far stronger than I gave you credit for." She stared at him, her chest tightening at his words. "Christopher, I'm not. I'm just trying to survive." "No," he said firmly, his voice low and steady. "You're much more than that." The air between them grew thick, charged with an energy that neither of them seemed willing to break. His eyes searched hers, and for a moment, she thought he might say something more, but instead, he reached across the table and took her hand in his. "Natalie," he began, his thumb brushing against her knuckles, this isn't what I expected." She swallowed hard, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he were struggling to find the right words. "When we started this, I told myself it was just business. That I wouldn't let it be anything more." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "But it is, you're more." Natalie's breath hitched, her mind racing. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the weight of his confession left her speechless. Before she could respond, Christopher stood, still holding her hand. "Come with me," he said, his voice softer now. He led her to the edge of the rooftop, where the city stretched out before them, glittering and alive. The wind tugged at her hair, and she shivered slightly in the cool night air. Christopher slipped off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, his hands lingering for a moment as he adjusted it. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't know how to be the man you deserve." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, and she turned to face him fully. "Christopher." He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. "But I want to try. If you'll let me." For the first time since this entire arrangement began, Natalie felt the walls around her heart begin to crack. She reached up, placing her hand over his, and nodded. "I'll let you." Christopher smiled a real, unguarded smile, and before she could say another word, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't like the rehearsed kiss from their wedding or the polite pecks during public appearances. This kiss was real, raw, and filled with an emotion that left her breathless. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face. "You're not pretending anymore," he murmured, his voice filled with awe. Neither was she. The next morning, Natalie woke to the sound of quiet murmuring coming from the other side of the penthouse. She slipped out of bed, wrapping herself in a soft robe, and padded toward the source of the noise. When she rounded the corner, she stopped in her tracks. Christopher was standing in the middle of the living room, his phone pressed to his ear and his free hand gripping the back of the couch. His voice was low, clipped, and sharp in a way she hadn't heard in weeks. "I don't care about the delay," he said, his tone icy. "Push the meeting if you have to, but I'm not leaving New York right now." Natalie frowned, stepping closer. He hadn't mentioned any plans to leave, but the tension in his voice told her it had been on the table. When he turned and saw her, his expression softened instantly, the hard lines of his face melting into something gentler. "I have to go," he said into the phone before hanging up. "You're up early." "So are you," she replied, folding her arms. "What was that about?" Christopher hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's nothing." Just work. Work that involves you leaving New York, she pressed, raising an eyebrow. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's a deal I've been working on for months. There's a meeting in London, but I told them I'm not going. Why not? She asked, genuinely curious. His eyes locked onto hers, and the intensity of his gaze made her heart skip. Because I don't want to leave you. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Christopher stepped closer, his hand reaching out to brush a stray strand of hair from her face. I meant what I said last night, he murmured, his voice steady. This isn't just a business arrangement for me anymore. I don't want to be away from you, Natalie. Not now. Not ever. Her chest tightened and she struggled to find the right words. But before she could respond, Christopher's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, his annoyance clear. Go, she said softly, nodding toward the phone. Take the call, I'll be here. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped back, answering the call as he walked toward his office. Natalie watched him go, her heart racing. The weight of his words lingered in the air, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, what they had was becoming real. That evening, Christopher insisted on taking her out, though he wouldn't tell her where. He had been secretive all day, disappearing into his office for hours before emerging with an unusual sense of excitement. Wear something nice, he had said with a small smirk. Something you love. When she stepped out of her room dressed in a sleek black cocktail dress with silver heels, Christopher's reaction was immediate. He froze, his gaze sweeping over her like she was the only thing in the world worth looking at. You're breathtaking, he said, his voice low and filled with something she couldn't quite name. You clean up pretty well yourself, she teased, taking in his perfectly tailored suit. The deep charcoal color made his blue eyes stand out even more, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. Without another word, he took her hand and led her to the elevator. The car ride was quiet, but this time it was a comfortable silence. Christopher kept her hand in his thumb tracing small circles on her skin as they drove through the city. When they arrived, Natalie's jaw dropped. They were at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but it wasn't the usual bustling scene. The entire place was empty. Did you rent out the Met? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Christopher smiled, a hint of mischief in his expression. I thought it might be nice to have the place to ourselves. She stared at him, completely stunned. You're unbelievable. Only for you, he said, his voice soft. They wandered through the halls, their footsteps echoing in the quiet. Natalie marveled at the art, but she couldn't help stealing glances at Christopher. He had let his guard down completely, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her chest ache in the best way. At one point they stopped in front of a massive painting of a starry night sky. Christopher turned to her, his expression serious. Natalie, he began, taking both of her hands in his. I know this started as something unconventional, but these past weeks with you have changed everything for me. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm not just going through the motions. You make me want to be better, to be worthy of you. Her breath hitched, tears welling in her eyes. Christopher. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Natalie's heart stopped as he opened it, revealing a stunning diamond ring that sparkled under the museum lights. I know we're already married, he said, his voice trembling slightly. But I want to do this the right way. I want you to know that I'm not asking out of obligation or convenience. I'm asking because I love you. Tears spilled down her cheeks as he dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. Natalie Harper Grayson, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Will you stay my wife, not because of a contract, but because you love me too? She laughed through her tears, nodding furiously. Yes. Of course, yes. Christopher stood, slipping the ring onto her finger before pulling her into his arms. He kissed her with a passion that left her dizzy, and for the first time she felt completely and utterly safe. The months that followed were nothing short of magical. Christopher made good on every promise he had ever made to her. He took her on spontaneous trips to Paris, heart's content, and filled their days with laughter and love. But it wasn't just the grand gestures that mattered. It was the quiet moments, the way he brought her coffee every morning, the way he held her hand during late-night walks, the way he looked at her like she was his entire world. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their penthouse overlooking the city, Christopher wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked, his voice soft. She leaned back against him, smiling. "Every day." He kissed the top of her head, his hold tightening. "I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I'm never letting go." "You don't have to," she whispered, turning to face him. "I'm not going anywhere." And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Natalie knew with absolute certainty that their love was the real deal, a love that had started as a business deal, but had grown into something far more beautiful than either of them could have ever imagined.